The year was 1921. Across the rolling, emerald-green prairies of northeastern Oklahoma, in lands once deemed worthless and relegated to Native American tribes by the federal government, something utterly fantastic had occurred. The Osage Nation, having been systematically pushed onto this rugged territory in the 1870s, discovered that beneath the shale and clay lay an ocean of black gold. This was not just oil. This was wealth so vast, so sudden, and so profoundly unearned by their conquerors that it warped the very fabric of American society around them. The Osage had shrewdly retained the mineral rights to their reservation lands, a monumental act of foresight by their 19th century leaders. When the drills struck pay dirt, the Osage people became, per capita, the wealthiest people in the entire world. A family living in a modest, well-built home might possess a checking account balance that dwarfed that of any Detroit industrialist or New York banker. They owned fleets of new automobiles, Cadillacs and Packards, and dressed in silks and wools imported from the finest European mills. They built mansions the size of state capitals, often hiring white servants and demanding the best of everything America had to offer. This wasn't just a local curiosity. It was an anomaly that scandalized and infuriated the established moneyed power structure of the surrounding white communities in places like Pawhuska and Bartlesville. The Osage were not supposed to have this kind of power. They were supposed to be wards of the state, beneficiaries of government handouts, recipients of charity, not titans of industry casually ordering custom-made clothing from Paris. The federal government, operating under the deeply paternalistic and often racist Osage Allotment Act, responded to this sudden opulence by imposing a guardianship system, ostensibly to protect the incompetent Osage from their own wealth. The system amounted to little more than legalized theft. White lawyers, bankers, and opportunists were appointed by courts to manage the millions flowing into Osage bank accounts. They charged exorbitant fees, invested unwisely, and often simply embezzled the principal. But even this wasn't enough for the greed that had taken root like a stubborn prairie weed. For those who saw the Osage's wealth not as something to be managed, but something to be taken, a far more terrifying mechanism was set into motion: inheritance. If a full-blood Osage individual died, their mineral headrights, the source of the wealth, would pass to their designated heirs. And in the twisted, desperate calculus of the era, the simplest legal path to outright ownership of that fortune was to remove the current holder from the equation. The true history of the 1920s Osage Nation is not about sudden, glittering luxury. It is a methodical, slow-motion American horror story. It is the story of a nation drowning in its own prosperity, where a suspicious death was not an accident, but an investment opportunity. Molly Burkhart lived in this strange, gilded cage. She was a full-blood Osage woman married to Ernest Burkhart, a white man whose ambitions were as expansive as the sky above their ranch. Molly had inherited a significant fortune from her own family, money that seemed to flow in only one direction, toward her husband and the circle of white men who managed their affairs. It began subtly, as true evil often does. Her older sister, Anna Brown, who was known to enjoy the pleasures that wealth could buy, was found shot dead in a ravine in the spring of 1921. The official ruling was quick: an unsolved case of a woman involved in shady dealings. The community whispered, but the Osage courts, controlled by white officials, swept the investigation under the dusty rug. Then, just a few months later, Molly's mother, Lizzie Q. Kyle, a matriarch of immense standing, fell violently ill. The sickness was sudden, debilitating, and resistant to the local doctors. Her decline was agonizing, marked by periods of paralysis and searing pain until she finally succumbed in the summer heat. The diagnosis? Kidney failure, perhaps exacerbated by a bad spring water source. A tragedy, the town murmured, shaking their heads at the misfortune that seemed to plague the wealthy Osage family. Molly was now the next in line, and the pattern didn't stop. Her second sister, Rita Smith, and Rita's husband, Bill, were killed in a bizarre explosion that ripped through their stately Osage home. The official story cited a gas leak, a common enough danger in the rapidly industrialized nation. But to those who were watching, the few Osage who still understood the depth of the hostility arrayed against them, it felt like a theatrical, over-the-top execution. By 1923, the list of dead Osage individuals, all wealthy, all with their headrights poised to transfer, was staggering. It was a statistical impossibility. It was an epidemic of untimely deaths, shootings, poisoning, inexplicable illnesses, and now bombing. This was not random chance. This was a coordinated, systematic campaign of extermination designed to transfer the world's largest pool of liquid wealth into white hands through the back door of inheritance law. The local authorities, many of whom were either complicit, benefiting from the structure, or simply intimidated by the forces at play, were worse than useless. The Osage had learned that appealing to the local sheriff or the county judge was akin to calling the butcher for help with a runaway pig. It was in this atmosphere of creeping, institutionalized terror that the Osage Tribal Council took the most desperate step in their history. They appealed not to the state, but to the federal government, to a fledgling, barely known investigative bureau in Washington, D.C., headquartered in a building that smelled faintly of fear and old documents. The Bureau of Investigation, the precursor to the FBI. They were asking J. Edgar Hoover's new brand G-Men to take on a case where the entire local power structure was either the suspect or the guard dog for the suspects. The Osage Legation understood that appealing to the local legal structure was akin to lighting a signal fire on a battlefield where the enemy controlled the cannons. The corruption was too deep, the network of complicity too wide. They needed a force unbound by the politics and the ingrained racism of Oklahoma Territory. They needed the federal government, and specifically, the young, ambitious Bureau of Investigation, the agency that would soon be known as the FBI. The appeal sent to Washington was not just a request for investigation. It was a desperate plea from a sovereign nation witnessing the systematic assassination of its wealthiest citizens. It was an indictment of American frontier justice. In the Capitol, the requests landed on the desk of the Bureau director, a driven, uncompromising man named J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover was keenly aware that his agency was fragile, still finding its footing, and desperately trying to prove its competence against powerful, entrenched interests. The Osage case presented an unprecedented opportunity and an enormous risk. To prosecute powerful white men in the Midwest for murdering Native Americans was not a politically safe endeavor. Yet the sheer scale of the organized crime, the documented deaths, the clear pattern of beneficiaries made it. Hoover handpicked his team, favoring agents who were young, incorruptible, and, crucially, willing to go deep undercover. Agents who could blend into the small, hostile towns surrounding the Osage Reservation. The lead investigator assigned was Tom White. White was a former Texas Ranger, a man with a quiet demeanor but a reputation for relentless pursuit. He understood the mentality of the outlaws he was hunting. He knew that in these isolated communities, the law of the land was often dictated by the man with the biggest ranch or the most political pull, not by a document signed in Washington. White's strategy was unconventional for the time. Infiltrate. He couldn't simply ride in wearing a suit and tie, announcing his federal authority. That would spook the conspirators, allowing them to cover their tracks or eliminate the next target. White brought in a small, trusted contingent, including agents who could pass for insurance salesmen, cattlemen, or oil brokers. Their mission was to move into the Osage country, Pawhuska, Fairfax, and Greyhorse, and become invisible. They had to gain the trust of the Osage people while simultaneously mapping the tangled web connecting the deceased, their heirs, the guardians, the local physicians signing death certificates, and the undertakers handling the bodies. The agents quickly discovered that the conspiracy was not merely a few isolated murderers. It was an elaborate interlocking system. It involved local doctors who were paid to classify murders as natural causes, lawyers who manipulated wills with forged documents, and local law enforcement officers who either looked the other way or actively participated in intimidation. The wealth itself acted as both the motive and the shield. The sheer volume of money flowing through these small towns meant that virtually everyone had a stake in keeping the system running smoothly, which meant keeping the source of that wealth, the full-blood Osage, alive just long enough to transfer their rights or dead if they stood in the way of a transfer. Tom White's men found themselves walking a razor's edge. Every friendly face might be an informant. Every conversation a trap. The Osage community, long traumatized by broken treaties and betrayals, was deeply skeptical of outsiders, even those claiming to bring salvation from Washington. The tension in the county reached a fever pitch. Whispers of federal interference were met with open contempt by the local elites. White knew that time was the most critical factor. As long as the conspirators believed they were safe, they would continue their work. But if they realized the hounds were closing in, the final, desperate act, the elimination of Molly Burkhart herself, would surely be moved to the top of the agenda. The ultimate prize, the entire Burkhart headright fortune, was dangling like a ripe fruit, waiting for the right blade to cut the stem. Tom White and his undercover agents quickly realized that the conspiracy wasn't just random opportunists. It centered around a singular, powerful figure, William K. Hale. Hale was not just a local rancher. He styled himself as a patriarch, a friend, a benefactor to the Osage people. He owned massive ranches, controlled local banks and insurance companies, and was known by nearly every white resident as the king of the Osage Hills. He would wear a 10-gallon hat, speak eloquently about his lifelong friendship with the Osage people, and yet behind closed doors, he was orchestrating a meticulous campaign of murder for profit. Hale's strategy was one of infiltration and trust. He understood that you couldn't just rob the Osage. You had to marry into the system. His primary tool for seizing control of headrights was through marriage alliances, often marrying his own relatives or close associates to Osage women. The key to the entire operation, however, was the Burkhart family. Ernest Burkhart, Molly's white husband, and his uncle, William Hale. The agents observed Ernest. He was weak-willed, easily led, and deeply covetous of the wealth his wife brought into their marriage. Hale had essentially groomed Ernest, encouraging the marriage to Molly years earlier, knowing that if Molly died, Ernest, and by extension Hale, who always seemed to be Ernest's silent business partner, would inherit. The undercover work became a dangerous game of chess. Agents had to watch Molly, who was growing progressively sicker, while simultaneously trying to turn Ernest. It was a psychological battle. Could they convince a man who lived in luxury, financed by his wife's potential death, that his uncle was a murderer, and that his own comfort was built on a foundation of blood? One agent managed to secure position close to Hale's operations, listening to fragmented, guarded conversations. The picture that emerged was chilling. Hale wasn't just arranging murders, he was controlling the entire ecosystem of death. He knew which doctor to call, which local sheriff to bribe, and which lawyer would successfully file the guardianship paperwork or the new will. The string of mysterious deaths, Anna, Lizzie Q, Rita Smith, were all nodes connected by the same calculated intent: transfer of wealth via premature demise. The agents realized the scope of the danger when they noted that the investigation itself was being monitored. Men who showed too much interest in the details of Rita Smith's explosion or Lizzie Q's sudden illness found their own lives suddenly under threat. A local Osage man who was quietly trying to hire his own private investigator was found shot dead in a seemingly random street robbery. Tom White understood that if they moved too aggressively, Hale would crush the investigation, and perhaps the agents themselves, under the weight of his local influence. They had to gather evidence so undeniable, so ironclad, that even the most corrupt local judge couldn't ignore it. They had to prove that the seemingly disconnected deaths were in fact chapters in a single monstrous American novel written in greed and death. The most critical evidence lay within the household itself, the relationship between Molly, Ernest, and Hale. Molly was fading, her strength ebbing away slowly, perhaps deliberately, with every passing month. Her death would be the final, perfect transaction, netting Hale and Ernest millions. The clock was ticking not just for the investigation, but for Molly's very survival. The air in the Osage Hills had become thick, not just with humidity, but with unspoken menace. For Tom White and his undercover agents, the only way forward was to dismantle the nest of deceit Hale had constructed around Molly Burkhart and her family. They knew that if Molly, the last surviving sibling in this direct line of inheritance, perished, the conspiracy would be complete, and they would have failed. The lust driving the plot was not merely from money. It was a profound, dark desire to possess what was not theirs, to own the very lifeblood of the Osage Nation's sovereignty. The agent established a perimeter of sorts, using local Osage allies who had the courage to defy the terror. They watched the Burkhart home, the domestic nest where Ernest and Molly lived. Molly was undeniably weak, her health deteriorating so rapidly that even the complicit local doctors could no longer credibly attribute it to simple illness. She was wasting away, her energy stolen by an unseen, continuous poison. Tom White's team had to move now. They couldn't wait for a smoking gun. The perpetrators were too skilled at cleaning up their own messes. The key was isolating Ernest before Hale could silence him or before Molly's final breath triggered the transfer of rights. Undercover agent Hugh Binge, posing as a wealthy cattle buyer with investments in Osage oil leases, managed to gain enough proximity to Ernest. Binge appealed to Ernest's vanity and his fear, the two levers that still held power over the weaker man. He didn't immediately accuse Hale. Instead, he planted seeds of doubt about Hale's true intentions for Ernest. "Uncle Bill is a smart man, Ernest," Binge murmured during a staged meeting at a local saloon. "But he loves those headrights more than his own kin. Molly's got years of money left. Why rush it? Unless he plans on cutting you out entirely once she's gone. He's got you running his errands, signing his papers. What happens to your share when the dust settles?" This appeal to Ernest's own lust for self-preservation and wealth, the very greed that led him to marry Molly in the first place, began to crack the facade of loyalty. He was realizing that in Hale's perfect scheme, Ernest was merely a disposable intermediary, not a true partner. The turning point came when agents were able to secure medical testimony from a reputable doctor outside the Osage Circle, who examined Molly's records and recognized the signs of slow, deliberate poisoning, likely arsenic, administered over a prolonged period. This was the chemical proof that tied the deliberate malice to the physical results. When confronted with this evidence and the terrifying possibility that Hale would dispose of him after Molly died, Ernest Burkhart finally broke. The fear of losing his ill-gotten comfort outweighed his loyalty to his uncle. He confessed, not just to the suspicion of poisoning, but to the entire architecture of murder surrounding the Osage wealth, naming Hale as the architect and detailing the roles of the local officials. The raids were swift and coordinated, moving across the county in a single dawn operation designed to overwhelm local resistance. Tom White himself led the team that arrested William Hale at his Grand Ranch headquarters. The sight of the powerful King being escorted away in handcuffs, his 10-gallon hat slightly askew, sent a shockwave through the Oklahoma plains that was louder than any dynamite blast. The investigation had breached the walls of the nest. But the final, crucial act remained. Would they secure the evidence in time to save Molly Burkhart? Or would the lust for the final inheritance claim its last victim before justice could be served? The arrests of William Hale and Ernest Burkhart, along with several local accomplices including the physician who certified deaths and the attorney who manipulated the trust funds, sent shockwaves across the nation, exposing a degree of organized predation that shocked even the hardened agents of the BOI. This wasn't just localized crime, it was systematic, wealthy terrorism aimed at extinguishing an entire class of people for their resources. The initial trials were brutal affairs, held in an environment still hostile to federal intervention. Hale, the self-proclaimed king, attempted to leverage his local power, attempting to bribe jurors and intimidate witnesses. He maintained his facade of the wronged friend, claiming he was only trying to protect the Osage from their own perceived incompetence. While Ernest, riddled with guilt and fear, wavered between pleading insanity and implicating his uncle. Tom White and his agents now faced their final, most delicate task, ensuring the nest of Molly Burkhart was truly secure. Molly herself was near death, her system ravaged by the slow poisoning. She was the ultimate living piece of evidence. The BOI agents had to guard her day and night, providing medical care that bypassed the compromised local doctors. It was a race against time, as Hale's network had contingencies in place. If one mechanism of control failed, another was ready to ensure Molly didn't live to testify against her husband and his uncle. Against all odds, Molly survived. The sustained poisoning, her recovery was slow, painful, and deeply traumatic, but her survival was the legal anchor the federal prosecutors needed. Her testimony, delivered with the quiet dignity that defined the Osage endurance, broke the complex web of lies woven by Hale. The prosecution, led by federal attorneys who brought significant weight from Washington, successfully dismantled Hale's defense. The jury finally saw the pattern: the ravine death, the mother's swift illness, the fiery explosion, and the continuous assault on Molly. William Hale was convicted for masterminding the murders. Ernest Burkhart, having fully turned state evidence, also received a conviction, though his sentence was notably lighter due to his cooperation. The conviction of Hale, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure across the state, was a monumental victory for the nascent FBI. It validated Hoover's decision to commit federal resources to the investigation, cementing the Bureau's reputation as a force capable of tackling corruption at the highest local levels. However, the victory was profoundly hollow for the Osage Nation. By the time the trials concluded, dozens of individuals had died under suspicious circumstances, and the wealth of many families was irrevocably lost to fraudulent guardianships, illegal sales, and outright theft. The oil wealth had brought curses alongside prosperity. The aftermath saw a complete overhaul of the Osage guardianship laws. a slow, painstaking process managed by the government to return some measure of control and funds back to the nation. But the trauma remained, etched into the history of the people. They had survived the physical assault, but the knowledge that their neighbors, their protectors, and even their in-laws had conspired to see them extinguished from money was a wound that would take generations to heal. The story of the Osage Reign of Terror remains a stark, astonishing reminder that in the pursuit of the American dream, especially when fueled by sudden, massive oil wealth, the darkest elements of human lust and avarice can manifest as organized, domestic terrorism hidden in plain sight within the nest of the community.